You are now listening to the Vegan Stuff podcast with Caavakushi.
Hosting this podcast today are our two AI hosts, Sam and Kim. If you simply can't get enough of us, go to caavakushi.com and sign up for our vegan newsletter and get our free 7-day high-protein vegan meal plan. And we also have some good news. We will be releasing our first ever cookbook pretty soon, so stay tuned. Hey, don't forget to follow us on our socials too.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are pulling back the curtain on one of the most idyllic picture postcard destinations in the world.
The Greek island of Santorini.
Exactly. But instead of focusing on those famous caldera sunsets, we're diving deep into a fierce, ongoing conflict that has pitted, well, ancient tradition and tourism profits against fundamental animal welfare for years.
Yeah, for a long time now.
We are examining the relentless use of donkeys and mules as taxis on the island.
It's a deep dive that really looks at years of, systemic failure. We've compiled a pretty rigorous stack of sources here, primarily detailed eyewitness investigations and extensive reports from PETA and its international affiliates.
Right.
And these stretch from 2018 right up to 2023. We've also got the corresponding legislative attempts, news reports. Our sources detail the suffering, yes, but more importantly, they map out the specific policy failures.
And the public campaigns.
Oh, the massive public campaigns that mobilize globally, and the consistent, documented resistance from local authorities to make any meaningful change.
So our mission today is pretty clear then. We need to unpack this dense legislative and ethical quagmire. We're trying to figure out why a global tourism hotspot, a destination that is so reliant on its reputation, seems to routinely ignore not just basic humane standards, but often its own legal mandates when it comes to animal care.
And it all unfolds in the island's capital, Fira.
And here's the core issue, our initial nugget of insight right at the start. The exploitation is centered on one grueling piece of infrastructure. These animals are forced to carry heavy loads up over 500 incredibly steep, often slippery steps connecting the port to the old town.
And critically, this practice is maintained purely by choice, not necessity. You have to understand the island has a perfectly functional, efficient, and, animal-friendly cable car that has been operating there for decades. It's capable of moving thousands of tourists quickly and safely. So the continued use of donkeys is therefore retained purely as a cultural or perhaps a novelty tourist attraction.
So it's an economic incentive.
It's a powerful one. So powerful that it has successfully stonewalled international outrage, major activist campaigns, and even the enforcement of Greek animal welfare laws.
That distinction, tradition versus modern necessity, that's absolutely vital here. Okay, let's unpack the initial context. We need to set the scene for you and define the physical and economic landscape in which this exploitation occurs. Let's jump into Section 1. The context of the exploitation and the tourist economy.
Let's start with the geography and the specific arduous job itself. The 500-plus steps connecting the port to the upper old town of Fira. Well, they're not gentle ramps.
No.
They are steep, they're uneven, and they can be particularly treacherous when wet or heavily trafficked. When these huge cruise ships arrive, they transfer thousands of passengers to the port below. These passengers then face that ascent.
And the animals are the mechanism used to ferry those passengers, right? They are literally the taxi service.
Exactly. They are used to transport tourists. And sometimes there are heavy bags and luggage up that intense incline. We're talking about a repetitive, grueling physical challenge that has to be performed multiple times a day during peak season.
And just so we're clear, we are discussing both donkeys and mules.
Right. And it's worth noting the distinction. Mules are the hybrid offspring of a male donkey and a female horse. And they're often prized for their stamina, their sure-footedness, and their ability to carry heavier loads than a pure donkey.
But even that has its limits.
Of course. Even with the increased resilience of a mule, the terrain and the sheer scale of the load are ultimately overwhelming.
And the scale is where the pressure comes from. You have to appreciate the sheer economic weight of Greek tourism. Greece is massively reliant on this sector.
Hugely. In the years leading up to these major exposés, particularly 2018, Greece was hitting record numbers. The entire national economy hinges on this influx.
And that traffic bottlenecks drastically on famous islands like Santorini.
Oh, completely. During the peak season, which traditionally runs from May through October, The island can see as many as 1,000 tourists flooding the capital every single day.
1,000 a day.
That is an incredible sustained surge of demand for transport up those steps.
And that volume translates directly into punishing working hours for these animals. How has the expansion of the tourist season affected their workload?
Well, the sources, specifically quoting advocates like Christina Colludi, who's the founder of the Santorini Animal Welfare Association, noted a major shift. The holiday season used to have a definite end, right? It provided a resting period.
Sure.
But due to global demand, that season has significantly extended. So the donkeys and mules are now working almost year-round.
Yeah.
This minimizes the recovery time needed for animals constantly subjected to this level of physical strain. It makes the exploitation continuous rather than seasonal.
And it's not just European tourists. This traffic is truly global, which is why the activists strategically targeted international audiences.
Absolutely. Tourists are pouring in from the UK, Germany, France, Australia, all of which fuel this specific element of the island's economy. And this created a dual strategy for PETA.
Which was?
Targeting the Greek government, for sure, but simultaneously appealing to the conscience of the international visitor.
That dual pressure point is key.
It is. The PETA reports even used the economic disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic as leverage. They argued that while the pandemic caused major damage to Greece's tourism, it offered a rare moment to pivot toward positive change.
So the appeal was, essentially,
If you want to rebuild your reputation, you have to shed this cruel practice. Don't be seen as a holiday destination that profits from documented animal cruelty. It was a powerful ethical challenge aimed squarely at responsible governance.
it sounds like a pressure cooker environment. So let's detail what that daily grind looks like for the animals themselves. What were the specific basic conditions exposed during these investigations?
The conditions are horrific, and crucially, they are systematically in violation of existing Greek animal welfare laws. The first major factor is the extreme heat.
I can imagine.
We are talking about the height of summer in the Aegean Sea, where temperatures can easily exceed 40 degrees Celsius. That's over 104 degrees Fahrenheit.
And the animals are working in this scorching heat day after day.
Yes, the animals are routinely tethered in the blazing sun without access to water, food, or shade. This denial of basic needs protection from the elements and hydration is a clear violation of Greek law.
I mean, if a person left a pet dog tied up in 40-degree heat without water, they would face criminal charges.
Of course they would. Yet this was the daily operating procedure for these working equines.
To manage the public perception of this, the sources noted some deceptive measures being employed. Can you explain that?
It was a minimal, almost performative effort. The investigators observed that sometimes a single water bucket would be placed at the top and another at the bottom of the 500 steps.
Okay, so water was there.
But, and this is the crucial part, the donkeys and mules were often tethered so tightly to posts or railings while waiting for the next fare that they simply could not stretch far enough to reach the water bucket to drink.
So it's just for show.
It was a visual aid for tourists, making it look like water was provided, when in reality, the animals were being actively prevented from accessing it.
And the exploitation doesn't end when the sun goes down and the tourist cruise ships depart.
No, the work is practically around the clock. Investigations showed that even in the very early hours of the morning, they are forced to continue hauling heavy loads.
Doing what?
The animals were documented being used to transport large, heavy bags of rubbish throughout the town of Fira. So you have animals carrying heavy tourists during the hottest part of the day, standing tethered without water, and then performing intense labor at night, all with inadequate rest or recovery time.
That cycle of relentless labor inevitably leads to the animals breaking down. What is the documented fate of those who are deemed too old or too weak to continue earning money?
The sources are heartbreakingly clear. Once the animal is no longer a productive asset, its welfare is entirely discarded. Those who become too old or weak to climb the steps or carry the loads are often simply abandoned and left to die.
Wow.
This highlights the brutal financial calculation at the heart of this practice. The animal is treated as disposable machinery, not a living creature with ongoing needs.
That sets a devastating picture of the daily life for these animals. Now, let's transition because this is where the policy details get really interesting and complex. This is Section 2, the core conflict, where we look at weight limits, veterinary recommendations, and failed legislation.
This section is absolutely crucial because it reveals the legislative cynicism involved. The law that was passed under pressure didn't meet any reasonable standard of humane care, and then even that insufficient law was just ignored.
Let's establish the foundation. what is the scientific consensus, the veterinary standard for carrying weight?
The veterinary recommendation is widely agreed upon across the equine community. A donkey or mule should not carry more than 20% of its own body weight.
20%.
20%. This is the established maximum limit to prevent undue strain, long-term spinal, joint, and hoof damage.
And what does that translate to in practical weight for a typical working donkey?
Generally, that equates to a maximum load of approximately 50 kilograms, or about 110 pounds. Anything over that is medically considered detrimental and abusive in the long run, especially considering the steep repetitive climbing involved in Santorini.
Right, so the issue reached a fever pitch in the summer of 2018, leading to international headlines, largely due to advocacy groups petitioning the Greek government to adopt this 50-kilogram standard. In response, the Greek Ministry for Rural Development passed a new law. What was the requirement they enacted?
The new law prohibited owners from burdening donkeys and mules with weights exceeding 100 kilograms.
100.
100 kilograms, which is approximately 220 pounds. It was positioned as a regulatory measure to curb the most egregious overloading.
Okay, let's pause right here because this is the massive policy gap that defines the failure. The legal limit is 100 kilograms. The veterinary recommendation is 50 kilograms. It is literally double the scientifically established humane limit.
It's double.
How do we even interpret a law that sets a legal standard twice as high as the medical standard?
I mean, it speaks volumes about the priorities, doesn't it? This was clearly a reactive law designed for public relations. It was intended to quell the international outrage without actually disrupting the profitability of the business.
So by setting the limit at 100 kilograms.
By setting it at 100, the Greek government basically legalized what is still considered an extremely heavy and damaging load for these animals. Instead of ending the cruelty, they merely codified a high level of strain as acceptable. They put a ceiling on the worst cases of abuse, but certainly not eliminating systemic harm.
It's the difference between establishing a truly humane ceiling and just defining where the cruelty becomes monstrous. And this is where we have to address the unfortunate language cited by news reports at the time.
Yes. When the law was passed, some news sources crudely termed this measure as formally banning obese tourists weighing over 220 pounds from riding. Now, while we have to report that this crude phrasing existed, the crucial takeaway is that the law did not protect the animals carrying the vast majority of tourists who weigh under 220 pounds.
Right.
The law was inherently flawed from an animal welfare perspective, regardless of the size of the rider.
And the final piece of this puzzle is enforcement. Even if you accept the flawed 100-kilogram standard, was it actually enforced on the ground?
Absolutely not. PETA's subsequent investigations in 2019 and again in 2022 revealed blatant flouting of the law. Tourists of all sizes and weights were still permitted to ride. The handlers just continued with the status quo, knowing they would likely face no consequence.
So we're looking at a legislative process that created a law that was insufficient by design, and then a governmental mechanism, the local municipality and police, that were either unwilling or unable to monitor or control the misconduct.
That paints the exact picture of systemic tolerance. The lack of enforcement, which includes failure to fine owners, remove animals, or regulate working hours, suggests that the local authorities tacitly approved the continued practice. The entire legislative effort was rendered meaningless because the political will to enforce even the basic rules was just missing.
That sets a horrifying context for the working conditions. Now let's move into Section 3, which documents the direct physical toll of this combination of overwork, extreme heat, and legislative failure. This is where the evidence becomes visually undeniable.
The physical deterioration found in the investigations is shocking. The issues start immediately with the gear used. Animals often suffer terrible wounds because of ill-fitting saddles. Crucially, investigators documented that some handlers were using makeshift saddle girths, sometimes even constructed from plastic hoses, to secure the load.
Plastic hoses, I mean, that must cause severe friction and acute injuries.
It does. The constant friction and pressure from these unsuitable, ill-fitting materials led to painful abrasions, raw skin, and open, bloody wounds. These injuries were documented repeatedly on the animals' abdomens, at the base of their tails where the equipment rubs, and on their legs. And these aren't just minor scrapes. These are open lesions exposed to dirt and heat, prime for infection.
Beyond the immediate, acute surface injuries, the sustained heavy loads and the steep climbs cause serious long-term musculoskeletal damage.
That's the silent killer here. The sources confirm that the persistent overloading leads to severe, debilitating long-term health problems, We're talking about chronic hoof issues, constant joint pain, and significant spinal injuries.
Wow.
One of the most damning findings was the observation that the ill-fitting saddles were leaving some animals effectively crippled. Furthermore, veterinarians reviewing the footage noted scar tissue on the head, legs, and where the girth sits, which served as physical proof of previous untreated injuries that had healed poorly while the animal was forced to continue working.
So, the animals are often working while severely injured, covered in open wounds. And the investigation noted specific problems with their headgear, too.
Did you know we have a vegan search engine, a vegan forum, a vegan newsletter, and so much more coming soon? So why not check us out at Caavakushi.com?
Yes, some animals were forced to wear incredibly tight muzzles, sometimes constructed of sharp metal wire.
Oh, that's awful.
These muzzles could injure the animal themselves, and if they were used to prevent biting, that's a sign of the animal being in severe distress. The 2018 footage also clearly showed animals with open head wounds that were just covered with flies, a vivid indicator of unsanitary conditions and total neglect.
The investigations also documented the active abuse by the human handlers when the animals inevitably stumbled or slowed down.
Eyewitness reports are consistent across the years. Handlers were seen dragging animals down the steps, whipping them, and hitting them repeatedly with sticks and fists to force them to keep moving.
Especially after a stumble.
Particularly after an animal had stumbled or refused to walk. This highlights that the abuse is not just neglect, it is active physical coercion when the animal's body fails to meet the economic demands.
And the cruelty extended to the tourists themselves.
That's right. Footage from October 2020 and again in July 2022 documented tourists themselves participating in the abuse, observed kicking the animals or digging their heels harshly into the donkey's flanks in an attempt to spur them on.
So when a tourist pays for a ride, they become a direct participant.
In maintaining this cycle of coercion, yes.
These documented findings prompted formal veterinary review, which lends serious professional weight to the activist claims. Can you elaborate on the conclusions of equine expert Dr. Maximilian Pick? He reviewed the 2022 footage, right?
He did, and Dr. Pick's review was definitive and comprehensive. As a respected veterinarian, he confirmed without reservation that the conditions documented amounted to cruelty. He cited specific, verifiable issues. First, the widespread untreated wounds and visible scar tissue. Second, the saddles and bridles were unsuitable and causing injury. Third, the animals were standing for long periods in blazing sun without water or food. And fourth, the consistent and illegal overloading of the animals. He even noted horrifying instances where 2 riders were forced onto a single animal.
2 riders on 1 animal.
Yes. His expert confirmation essentially validated every claim made by the eyewitness investigators.
Beyond the cruelty to the animals, the operation creates a serious public safety hazard for pedestrians.
Absolutely. When you have exhausted, injured, and coerced animals trying to navigate hundreds of steep, uneven steps, they stumble. Unsupervised or poorly controlled animals endanger nearby tourists who are just walking.
And the PETA Germany eyewitnesses reported this.
They reported having to dodge struggling animals frequently.
And there was one very specific, dramatic anecdote in the sources that illustrates this danger vividly.
Yes. The sheer chaos created by struggling, overworked animals was such that one eyewitness reported a man having to physically jump onto a narrow, low wall which had an unsecured drop on the other side, just to avoid being crushed or injured by a struggling donkey and its load.
That anecdote really brings to life the chaotic and dangerous environment created by this practice.
It does.
And sadly, the danger has, on occasion, turned fatal.
Tragically so. The sources cite a fatal incident from 2015, preceding these major exposés, where a woman was trampled to death by a donkey.
That's the starkest possible illustration that this exploitation is not just an animal welfare issue. It creates a hazardous environment for the human visitors who are supposed to be enjoying a safe holiday.
Exactly.
That sets a context of undeniable suffering and systemic failure. This inevitably brings us to Section 4, the escalation of activism and official resistance. How did the activist community respond to years of watching this abuse persist, despite that insufficient 100-kilogram law?
Well, they realized that incremental regulation was failing, and they needed to create immense global pressure to force an outright ban. The public response to the documented findings was enormous.
How big are we talking?
PETA and its international affiliates mobilized support on a global scale. By September 2020, they had already amassed over 161,000 petition signatures. By early 2023, that number had swelled to over 255,990 supporters, calling for an immediate and permanent ban on the rides.
And their core message to the Greek government was unified.
It was a moral and ethical ultimatum. Greece, as a major global destination, could not continue to profit from documented systemic cruelty. The demand was for responsible governance and an end to the practice.
But the local authorities in Santorini were not only failing to enforce the law, they were actively fighting back against the activist campaigns. Let's look at the June 2019 attempted advertising campaign.
This incident is a crucial insight into the local politics and systemic resistance. PETA attempted a very localized, very direct public awareness campaign. They sought to run advertisements on local Santorini buses and taxis.
Right on the island itself.
Right there, showing an exhausted donkey next to the simple, unambiguous message. Donkeys suffer for tourists. Please don't ride them.
And the municipality blocked it. Why?
Santorini's municipal government simply refused authorization for the ads. And the reason provided by a representative from the local ad company was illuminating. Many bus and taxi drivers also happen to own the donkeys used for tourist transport.
So a direct conflict of interest.
A direct conflict of interest embedded within the municipal power structure. The very individuals whose businesses the ads would harm were either directly involved in local governance or had significant influence over it, allowing them to censor ethical messaging that threatened their secondary source of income.
That's a fascinating nugget. It means the municipal apparatus designed to manage public space and advertising was effectively protecting the profits of its own employees and associates.
Exactly. It shows that the resistance wasn't just passive neglect. It was an active exercise of power to maintain the economic status quo.
What was the official defense from the local political leadership at the time?
The Santorini mayor at the time, Nikos Zorsos, issued a counterclaim, arguing that he cared deeply about the animals' well-being and insisted that elected officials had absolutely nothing to do with blocking the advertising campaigns.
A statement that stands in direct contrast to the facts on the ground.
It does, especially given the ad company's explanation of the underlying conflict of interest.
So PETA Germany, facing this blatant local censorship, refused to give up the fight. They just shifted their target.
They showed remarkable persistence and strategic thinking. In September 2019, they initiated a massive ad blitz in neighboring, highly trafficked coastal towns, Rafina and Piraeus.
Which are major transit hubs for travelers heading to the islands.
Precisely. They placed over 100 ads on ferries, taxis, buses, and billboards with the message, "Help stop cruelty, please don't ride the donkeys and mules." They were ensuring that tourists planning a trip to Santorini saw the ethical warning before they arrived on the island, bypassing the local censorship entirely.
This issue also gained incredible global visibility through international protests and celebrity endorsements, adding another layer of external pressure on the Greek national government.
The protests were strategically held at Greek embassies globally, in places like Berlin and Washington, D.C. In Berlin, activists used highly visible props, including an activist riding a bleeding toy donkey to vividly dramatize the animal suffering.
Turning a local issue into an international PR crisis for Greece. And the celebrity support brought the issue to an entirely new audience. Tell us about the involvement of Tommy Lee.
Right, the involvement of Athens-born Mötley Crüe drummer Tommy Lee in December 2019 was a significant moment. He wrote this strongly worded personal letter to the Minister for Agricultural Development and Food, Makis Voridis.
And he mentioned his own background.
Oh, yes. He highlighted his own Greek heritage and expressed genuine anger that the insufficient 100-kilogram weight law was not being enforced. He noted that he had recently visited Santorini himself on a yacht trip and made a point of refusing to ride the donkeys, urging all tourists to use what he called the cool cable car instead.
So his intervention helped amplify the message beyond activist circles.
And into mainstream pop culture and tourism dialogue, yeah.
Despite all this global pressure and public outcry, the systematic cruelty persisted. This culminates in the most recent official action detailed in our sources, the legal complaint filed in 2023. This moves the fight from petitioning to prosecution.
This represents the final stage of frustration for the activists. When legislation fails and political lobbying is ignored, the only recourse is the judicial system. PETA Germany and the Greek organization Hypothesis Panhellenic Equine Welfare Society filed a criminal legal complaint with Greek authorities, basing their charges on that compelling 2022 eyewitness footage.
And this is where the action gets particularly pointed. They weren't just charging the frontline abusers. Who specifically were the targets of these criminal charges?
They charged 3 distinct categories of responsibility. First, the individual animal owners. Second, the donkey handlers who were documented engaging in abuse.
And
third, and most significantly, They filed criminal charges against the local authorities themselves. This included the current mayor of Santorini, Antonis Sigalis, several municipal employees, and both current and former police chiefs.
That's a huge step. They weren't just prosecuting individual acts of cruelty, they were targeting the systemic failure of governance.
Exactly. The core of the complaint was that these officials were unable or unwilling to end the violations of Greek animal welfare regulations. The advocates argued that the authorities were fully aware of the ongoing abuse, the lack of water, the extreme working hours, and the flouting of the 100-kilogram law, yet they failed in their duty to monitor, control, and punish the misconduct.
So the legal argument is that institutional failure to enforce the law is complicity in the criminal abuse of animals.
That's it. This action forces accountability directly onto the highest local, political, and law enforcement figures.
It demonstrates the advocates' conclusion that the only way to fundamentally change the situation is to remove the institutional shield protecting the profitable status quo. We have covered years of intense activity. Exposés, insufficient laws, censorship attempts, global campaigns, and finally, criminal charges.
The takeaway from this entire timeline is the persistent, almost impenetrable wall of resistance mounted by the local economy against ethical change, regardless of how overwhelming the evidence of cruelty became.
The economic incentive consistently outweighed the legal, ethical, and public relations costs.
Consistently.
Now, as we wrap up this deep dive, let's synthesize the findings and consider the broader implications for you, the listener. What are the core conflicts driving this ongoing, protracted controversy?
Well, we've identified three fundamental failures. First, you have the legislative failure to create a humane standard. That 100-kilogram limit was double the medical standard, making cruelty legal. Second, the enforcement failure local authorities consistently ignored the insufficient law, displaying a political unwillingness to monitor and punish misconduct.
And third,
the ethical blindness of the tourism audit itself, prioritizing novelty and profit over animal well-being, despite readily available modern alternatives like the cable car.
And for the advocates, the consistent solution demanded is not better oversight, but a complete ban.
Their position is pragmatic. They argue that as long as the economic engine exists, as long as a donkey ride up those steps generates, money regulation will always fail due to local conflict of interest and lack of enforcement.
So for them, there's no middle ground.
No. PETA's consistent messaging is that the only guaranteed solution is an outright ban on the rides, followed by the retirement of the donkeys and mules to reputable sanctuaries where they can receive necessary care.
This local struggle in Santorini, however unique its geography, clearly connects to a much broader global shift in tourist ethics and expectations. Tourists today are vastly more informed about the consequences of their spending choices.
Absolutely. The increasing awareness means the global tourism community is facing ethical scrutiny in ways it wasn't 20 years ago. The shift away from using sentient beings as vehicles for entertainment or transport is not isolated to this Greek island. It is part of a growing movement toward what is often termed compassionate tourism.
Here's where it gets really interesting, connecting this specific long-running conflict to international precedent. The sources remind us that other cities facing similar ethical quandaries regarding animal transport have already taken decisive action.
That's right, and these examples provide a clear roadmap for Santorini. The cities that have implemented bans or severe restrictions on horse-drawn carriages, a very similar historical novelty transport industry, demonstrate that alternatives are viable.
And the sources specifically cite?
They cite Mallorca in Spain, Chicago in the United States, Prague in the Czech Republic, and Montreal in Canada. These are major global cities that recognize the inherent conflict between equine welfare and modern city life and chose to end the practice. They've proven that tourist economies can thrive without relying on animal exploitation.
Those comparisons highlight that Santorini's resistance is not just an inevitable cultural hangover, but a deliberate economic choice being made against a clear global trend.
Precisely. These examples remove the argument that it's simply impossible to end the practice. The challenge in Santorini is political and economic, not logistical. The means to eliminate the need for the donkeys, that cable car, it already exists.
That brings us to our final provocative thought for you. Something to mull over as you process the detailed systemic failures we've covered. Given the existence of the cable car, given the systemic failure of the local government to enforce even its own flawed laws, and given that international cities have already implemented bans on animal transport, what level of ultimate responsibility does the global tourist community hold in maintaining the status quo in places like Santorini?
Think about the power of the purse. The donkeys work because tourists from Germany, the UK, Australia, and the US pay for the ride. Every euro spent is a direct vote for the continuation of that specific business model. If the international tourist market unanimously decided to use the cable car, the donkey ride economy would face catastrophic financial pressure almost overnight, forcing the local authorities to act.
So the question becomes,
If a local government is demonstrably unwilling to enforce humane laws, does the burden of ethical practice shift entirely to you, the consumer, forcing you to become the final moral regulator through your own travel choices? How much weight, literally and ethically, does your next vacation choice carry?
a tough, complex, and vital question that spans continents and policies. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the controversial and unfortunately ongoing situation in Santorini.
Always a pleasure to help unpack the details behind the headlines.
We'll get you next time for another deep dive.
Thanks for listening. We hope you liked this episode. If you did, we'd really appreciate it if you could give us 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. Also, we would be so appreciative if you could just share this episode or this podcast with all your friends and family who are vegans or vegan friendly. We're also really excited because we are going to be launching something really cool pretty soon on the site, so keep an eye out for that. And we will see you really soon with a new episode.